Hello there, my name's Jon Pressnell, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a background to the man behind MG, the man that created the MG sports car marque, Cecil Kimber. I'm not going to give you a crash course in the history of MG cars from the crown wheel and pinion to the overhead camshaft, but um, what I'm going to try and do is fill in the background, as I say, to the man that created those cars via a number of, if you like, takeaways from the biography of Cecil Kimber, which I wrote and had published last year. So things that have stuck in my mind to a degree, a romp rather than a trudge with a selection of illustrations, which I'll try and talk you through at the same time. The picture that you will see now is a picture of Kimber. Kim, he was known as by everyone. Invariably, he was known as Kim. You'll see he was a small man and he walked with a pronounced limp. He was full of energy, full of enthusiasm. He was, if you like, very much the public face of MG, Mr. MG. He knew many of its customers personally. Everyone in the industry knew him. He organised, these were quite well known, rip-roaring parties for the motor trade at motor show time. But alongside that, he ran a tight ship at the factory, and sometimes he was a little feared. But he was always someone that was respected. He was regarded as a fair and a decent boss. He also, and this is very much part of his character, he had a natural flair for publicity. He actually worked with well-known artists to put together a lot of the artwork and the advertising for MGs. He was quite a talented artist himself in his own right. Also, a keen photographer, which is a blessing, of course, for a biographer, because through the various branches of the family, an awful lot of his own personal photographs have survived. But behind the public persona, what sort of a man was Cecil Kimber? For his private life, we can only really rely on the memories of his two daughters and his stepdaughter, which they in turn handed down to their parent, their children. Well, that's where the fun starts, if you like. Well, it certainly was fun for me. Kimber's younger daughter, Jean, spent much of her life trying to piece together her father's life. She wrote extensively about it, but she was only a young girl during most of the time that her father was running MG. What she gleaned was largely secondhand. Worse, Jean clearly hero worshipped her father, which, it has to be admitted, is an obstacle to impartial objectivity. In contrast, elder daughter Betty fell out with her father big time. Relations between the two sisters were evidently very tense. Wilson McComb, well-known MG historian that some of you may have heard of, actually managed to get the two ladies together. It was like lighting a match to find a gas leak, he later wrote. I ended up reliving that explosion. I don't think I'm exaggerating too much. Betty had three children, each by a different man, and none by her husband, who was future RAC Motorsports Supremo Dean Delamont. Two of the children of Betty, two of Betty's children, refused to speak to me. I won't say any more than that. The third, however, was very generous with her time and relayed to me quite a number of stories, stories passed down, of course, by her mother. The only problem was that an awful lot of the stories were tosh. They were simply not true. What did emerge, though, was a completely different Cecil Kimber, Another Cecil Kimber from the Cecil Kimber portrayed in Jean's writings. This particular branch of the family had, and I think I can truly say still has, a sort of seething resentment of Cecil Kimber. That might come as a bit of a shock, but on one side you had Jean, who recounted how her father was a wonderful parent, full of energy, who made every outing an adventure, not least on family sailing holidays, because sailing was very much a passion of Cecil Kimber's. But for Betty, her father was a hypocrite. He was an adulterer. He was someone who suppressed her blossoming as a young adult and blighted her later life. As a father, he was psychologically catastrophic, was in fact the view of Betty's daughter, Sarah. Blimey, as a biographer, well, at least it gives you some material. But I better give a little bit of background to that. And I think it's important to observe that we all have our secret gardens, and quite frequently there's the person you know at work and you know nothing about his secret garden as or her secret garden as a private person. Similarly, if you know someone as a private person, quite often you know nothing at all about the other secret garden, which of course is their professional life. Kim's personal life was, I'm sure, a secret garden for many of his friends and colleagues. But for some of them, it became a little less of a secret. Crucially, too, it was arguably a factor in the ending of his career at MG, which we'll obviously come to a little bit later on. We'll spool back in two sort of steps, if you like, here. Let's go back first off to 1915. It's probably useful if I just remind you, Kimber was actually born in 1888, so he was very much a child of the Victorian era. In 1915, he married a lady called Irene Hunt, known as Reen. Not Renee, by the way, as you might have seen in one or two magazine articles. She was known as Reen, short for Irene. Hopefully a picture of Reen will have popped up for you by now. The two seemed to make a good couple. Reen was a dynamic lady who pushed Kimber forward. It seems likely, in fact, that she persuaded him to take his first steps into the motor industry at the time of their marriage, when he joined a company called Sheffield Simplex. And the picture that you're seeing now is one of my favourite pictures from the book, and it's not of an MG, it's of a Sheffield Simplex, which was an upmarket car made in relatively small numbers. And one of the reasons that print is so lovely is because it's from a glass plate negative that gives you fabulous definition. When you think that that photograph is what is probably about 110 years old, and it just sings, doesn't it? It was said later on that Reen helped Kimber sketch out the requirements for what became, and again, we're going to come back to that, what became the first MG. She modelled for publicity photographs for the first cars. But as MG grew as a business, and I suppose these things are sometimes inevitable, she found herself becoming increasingly remote from the business. And at this stage, we're talking about the beginning of the 1930s, probably around 1932, Cecil Kimber met a younger lady, a dental nurse by the name of Muriel Dewar, who was invariably known as Gilly. By the mid-1930s, that had become a full-blown affair. Meanwhile, Reen had become ill, possibly exacerbated by the stresses in her marriage. She was suffering from colitis, which is not a particularly pleasant thing. I'm not a doctor, but I did consult the doctor friend when I was writing the book, and he confirmed that really it's not pleasurable. Reen became depressed and prone to mood swings. She turned to religion. Cecil Kimber was obviously, well, it's a bit of a downer if you've got an unhappy, ill wife. Um, and he turned to Gilly, who was uncomplicated, bubbling and fun, and formed a wonderful double act with her sister. There were a couple of live wire, relatively young ladies, and that put a bit of vim into Kim's private life, but obviously it's not a recipe for a successful marriage. In 1937, Cecil and Reen Kimber separated. Kimber set his wife up in a flat in Bournemouth, along with Betty, his elder daughter, while Jean was packed off to boarding school. Betty, and this is all, this is one of the sort of killer events, if you like, in the family life. Betty won a scholarship to St Anne's College in Oxford, and Kimber wouldn't let her take it. The story is that he didn't like the idea of intellectual women, and didn't really feel that a woman's place was in an Oxford college. This rankled with Betty all her life, according to her daughter Sarah. The story handed down by Betty's family is that instead she was forced to look after her dying mother, who dragged her around gloomy churches, while her father was supposedly up in Oxford cavorting with his mistress. How true this picture is of Betty having a miserable time visiting gloomy old churches, and how true the story is of Cecil Kimber, who I think was a little bit more discreet than that, cavorting around Oxford with his mistress, is another story. The picture that you should have now seen shows a manifestly happy Betty during that period. Her friendship with Dean Delamont was obviously part of the enjoyment that she obviously manifested down in Bournemouth. And there's a picture of Dean with Reen and Jean. But after a botched operation, Reen died in April 1938. And in June that year, Kimber married Gilly. That's moving quite fast, and eyebrows, as I will tell you, were raised at this. Gilly and Kim eventually set up home in Pangbourne near Reading, so not a million miles from Abingdon. Betty, meanwhile, was obliged to give up her semi-independent life, and was obviously at quite a tense time sometimes in that little home in Pangbourne. There were stories of rows, of books and records being thrown on the fire by Kimber when he didn't approve of what his elder daughter was reading or listening to. Betty had turned into a, well, maybe you'd call her a rebel. Certainly by 1930s standards, she had progressive political views. She liked jazz, which of course was unpardonable in some circles. Cecil Kimber was meat and two veg, Gilbert and Sullivan man. So he didn't have very sophisticated musical tastes. And then Betty compounded the whole thing by getting married to Dean Delamont against her father's wishes. The rupture was total. Betty, who now called herself Lisa, became, to use the Orwellian phrase, a bit of an unperson. At Kimber's death, she wasn't even mentioned in the legal correspondence about compensation. That, if you like, is the side of Kimber, Mr. MG, Mr. Nice Guy, that one didn't see. I have to admit that I found Betty absolutely fascinating. Far more interesting person than her younger sister. In Bournemouth, she hung out with a white witch by the name of Sybil Leek. She was into progressive theatre, funny foreign books, for funny foreign foods, ecology. In later life, she hung around a circle of sort of trendy Hampstead intellectuals. And of course, she had those three children by different fathers, all of whom seemed to be quite interesting blokes. In fact, she's probably worth a book in her own right. So that background, and that background is important, done and dusted. Let's get back on track. And we'll hop back a little bit more just to give a bit of Kimber's own family background, his origins and his early life. His father, Henry, came from a family that was an important player in the printing industry. With his brother, he ran a business in Manchester, specializing in printing inks. Occasionally, you'd have a little noodle on the internet and at eBay, and you could even end up bidding for a Kimber printing press. I did actually find one, but I resisted the temptation. According to Jean, Kimber's father was a bit of an old misery. She eventually discovered why and was prepared to pardon him at least a little bit. He was a keen cyclist in the early days when you cycled on an ordinary, a penny farthing. And he devised or helped devise a luggage carrier for penny farthings. Well, penny farthings, I've never ridden one, but I think I can safely assume that they weren't the most stable of bicycles. And you added a carrier to them, they became more unstable. And one day he had a nasty accident and fell from his penny farthing and suffered concussion. And as a result of that, he had blinding headaches for the rest of his life, which made him a grumpy old bugger. Meanwhile, family legend has it that his wife Fanny had actually wanted to marry a rather swashbuckling novelist called Morley Roberts. But the match was apparently vetoed by the family, and she was obliged to marry Henry Kimber instead. How true this is, it's obviously fairly difficult to ascertain more than a century onwards. What does seem to be the case is that she would much rather pack up her paint box and disappear off into the countryside to paint rather than look after her children. So it's reasonable to assume that the Kimber household wasn't the sunniest of places. Still, Cecil Kimber obviously inherited his mother's artistic genes and enjoyed drawing, painting, and photography, as I mentioned. And during his childhood, he also discovered sailing. Rather more importantly, though, he developed an interest in cars and motorcycles. As alas is often the case, an interest in the latter can result in unfortunate occurrences. And in the case of Cecil Kimber, and you can see that picture of a rather mashed up motorbike, he had an accident in 1910 when he was on his motorbike running an errand for his mother, and he was hit by a car. And his leg, his right leg, was badly damaged. In fact, surgery in those days was not always as good as it could have been. And attempts to reset the leg proved disastrous, and he came close to actually having the leg amputated. In the end, the bones started to knit together, and his leg was saved, but it ended up 2 inches shorter than his left leg. So Kimber was left with a very pronounced limp. And really throughout his life, it was something that still gave him a great deal of pain. I think the usual thing, on a wet day, it hurt more than on a dry day. As a young man, Kimber had worked for his father, traveling around selling printing ink in a little Singer car. But the business was on the slide, and Henry Kimber wanted Cecil to invest his compensation money from the accident into the family firm. Kimber, who obviously got a fairly sound financial and business sense, refused to do this and actually jumped from what was clearly a sinking ship. And father and son never spoke to each other again. So a turbulent childhood and early adulthood. What's interesting is that Kimber actually talked very little about his early years. And in fact, if you read my book, which obviously I hope you will do, you'll notice that there are a fair number of imponderables about what he did and when he did it in his early years. But in summary, he spent a short period at Sheffield Simplex, and that was then followed by some time at AC Cars, that was then just starting out down in Surrey, and a short spell with an aircraft manufacturer called Martinside, who latterly went on to make motorbikes. The picture you see there is of Martinside's, I wouldn't say it's their greatest hit. It was the plane that they were probably best known for. It's known as the Elephant, and it had the aeronautical qualities of an elephant. It could just about lumber into the sky and make forward motion. It was not a success for Martinside, and Martinside made a much better fist of making SE4s under license. And after the war, concentrated on motorbikes. Little bit more is known about Kimber's next employer, e.g. Wrigley and Company. Now, if you know your Morris history, your ears will have perked up at the name of Wrigley, nothing to do with the chewing gum people. Wrigley's made car axles. Notably, they made them for a chap called William Morris, whose name you might have heard of. That's a picture of William Morris in later life that you should be seeing now. The relationship between Morris and Wrigley's could have been a great relationship. In fact, it was awful. Wrigley's were always very condescending about Morris. They called him Woolard's little garage friend from Oxford, Frank Woolard being the Wrigley's engineer who'd drawn up the axles for the first Morris cars at Wrigley, Frank Woolard. So yes, they called Morris Woolard's little garage friend from Oxford, because Morris at that stage was running at the Morris garages in Oxford, selling cars, hiring cars, selling motorbikes, and so on. Not only that, but the boss of Wrigley's was someone who went on and droned on and on about being related to ancient Scottish kings, which bored William Morris rigid. After the First World War, Morris decided that he would take his business elsewhere, which was a big blow for Wrigley's. And this is where Cecil Kimber comes into the Wrigley's story. Wrigley's became part of a consortium to build a car called the Angus Sanderson, and that's a picture of the Angus Sanderson that you'll see now. It was a car, as I say, built by a consortium of people, including, and journalists love telling this story, including a company that was better known for making lavatory systems. The venture was not a success, and Angus Sanderson failed in 1921. Kimber, it seems, had invested some, perhaps all, it's never been totally clear, of his compensation money in the project to build the Angus Sanderson car. And he lost his shirt. He and Frank Woolard jumped ship. Woolard ended up running Morris's engine factory, and in fact developed a reputation as being one of the world's best flow production engineers. In fact, if you've heard of talk of people like Toyota inventing just-in-time inventories and flow production techniques in their factories in Japan, they were actually following in the footsteps of Frank Woolard, and that was in the 1920s. He was a pioneering figure in production engineering. Anyway, Woolard ended up at Morris Engines, And Cecil Kimber was taken on as sales manager for the Morris retail business in Oxford that still existed, the Morris Garages. Within a few months, he'd become general manager. Morris, by the way, ended up buying Wrigley's when it went into receivership in 1923 and turned it over to a factory to make Morris commercial vehicles, lorries of one sort or another. My next little sort of takeaway from exploring the history of Cecil Kimber is a realization of how Kimber cleverly rode through upsets to establish MG as a marque in its own right. In fact, if there's one thing that jumps out when you study Kimber's life, it's that he was good at seizing opportunities, making the most of them. Yeah, like anyone, he was lucky. But to a degree, he was someone who made his own luck. Partly because he was adaptable, he was pragmatic. Not bad aptitudes for a businessman. Barely were his feet under the desk at Morris Garages when he was thinking of a special Morris Garages version of the famous Bullnose Morris. This was known as the Chummy. The Chummy name was quite often used for an occasional four-seater open car. Quite a few of you doubtless remember the Austin 7 Chummy, which was an occasional four-seater if you were a little bit optimistic and had two very small children. Car Bodies in Coventry, which was a firm supplying bodies to a large number of manufacturers, provided the body, and final assembly took place in an old stable building in an Oxford mews. This was a part-time activity. This was something they sold cars and motorbikes during the day, and in the evening they knocked out a few chummies. The tools were limited. In fact, they were so limited that they didn't amount to much more than a manual breast drill in the early days. That was about as automated as it got. The Chummy was actually a great success. So much so that William Morris thought it was such a good idea that he'd make them himself. So he casually pulled the rug out from underneath Cecil Kimber's sideline of making little, should we call them 2+2, open Morris cars. So Kimber had to think again. Maybe something a little bit more sporting might be the ticket, something that Morris wasn't offering. Well, in fact, Morris did offer a sports version of the Bullnose, but they were just in the throes of discontinuing it because it hadn't been a huge success. But Kimber came up with a little two-seater based on the Bullnose Morris with a jaunty five-piece front screen, windscreen, a five-piece windscreen, a body built by a local firm called Rayworth's. And he called this the MG Super Sports Morris, with a dot after the M and a dot after the G. He was quite particular about that. He thought it looked better with the dots. Well, maybe. I'm not too sure about that, but that was a decision he took. Unfortunately, sales were less than stratospheric. Just 6 ended up being made. The next change of tack came by chance, really. A travelling rep for the Sunbeam Motorcycle Company turned up at the Morris Garages in a Bullnose with a very smart sports body. Kimber was impressed. At the same time, one of his salesmen, Jack Gardiner, decided he wanted to have a Morris of his own with a sporting body. Kimber arranged for a body to be made on pretty much the same lines as the Sunbeam rep's car. And that was the start of a line of MG Super Sports, 4-seaters and 2-seaters, and some saloons. You can see there a picture of a Super Sports Tourer. and also a picture of the famous old number one, which is regularly described as the first MG, but which in fact is nothing of the sort, and actually came along in 1925 and was a one-off. I'm not going to go into a discussion of old number one because we'll be here tomorrow if I attempt it. But suffice it to say that more baloney has been written about old number one than about any other MG. Anyway, onwards and upwards, Kimber was busy assembling these super sports four-seaters and two-seaters in the Mews. Big excitement when a bit of mechanization arrived. 2 electric drills, big time now. And in 1925, eventually, Kimber persuaded Morris to let him have a corner of the new factory that was being built to build radiators for Morris, the Morris Radiators branch. From half a dozen people shuffling cars around in the Mews, the labour force jumped to 50 people. For the 1926 season, roughly 180 cars were made. Kimber, I think we could safely say, had arrived. 180 cars in a year is not bad going. But then Morris stopped production of the bullnose with that lovely bullnose or bullet-nosed front. It looks lovely, but actually doesn't cool the car very well. But never mind. The replacement, which had a more modern sort of tombstone-shaped radiator, we always sort of tend to call that a flat nose in Morris and MG circles, was less elegant and it was heavier. Despair descended because Kimber had an eye for a line. He always had an eye for a line, and those early bullnose MGs were very smart-looking cars. What were they going to do with this thing that was mechanically improved, but which sat high on its wheels and had this big flat radiator grille? Well, in the end, they managed to make a new MG out of this seemingly unpromising material. And that's a rather nice picture there of a flat nose super sports. They made the body lighter to compensate for the extra weight, and they hid the bottom of the radiator grille to make it look less tall. More than that, the car took on a wholly MG identity. No longer were the super sports called Morrises. From late 1927, they were actually registered as MGs for the first time. That year, there was also a new factory at Edmund Road, just off the Cowley Road, which was the first proper MG factory. Morris Garages even had its own stand for the first time at the motor show, selling the cars as MGs. The company, the MG Car Company, was formed as a subsidiary of the Morris Garages, and now there was no argument. MG was a marque in its own right. Where next? Obviously, could he have continued just churning out titivated, flat-nosed Morrises? There are limits, really, to what you can achieve with that sort of raw material. And selling what was basically hotted up flat-nosed Morris in a party frock. Another thing that people forget was that however shrewd Kimber was, he was capable of making a wrong call. What was quite interesting is that Kimber made a wrong call in his next move, but he lucked out at the same time and was able to launch MG on its real trajectory as a successful sports car manufacturer. If he was going to move away from a titivated flat nose, it was going to be perforce, well, that's what he thought anyway, a move up market. Something better than what he'd been doing up until that time, reasonable enough. And the opportunity came when Morris launched a 6-cylinder model in late 1927. It was actually, if we're honest, a pretty awful motor car, this 6-cylinder Morris, and it actually had to be redesigned before it entered production. But The 2.5 litre engine had an overhead camshaft, which was something pretty advanced for the time, and looked quite a promising power unit. In fact, the story goes, how true this is another matter, that Kimber cooked up the design of the engine with his old friend Frank Woolard at Morris Engines, and the two then sold the idea of a 6-cylinder car to William Morris. A pinch of salt should be taken with that particular interpretation of history. It's a nice story, but all the timings are wrong. Kimber started out by just popping a sporting body on this new Morris chassis, but soon discovered, as did anyone else that drove the thing, that the chassis was no good. It was basically an adaptation of the old flat nose chassis, and it wasn't up to coping with a 6-cylinder power unit. Kimber had a new frame designed, a new chassis frame designed, and the MG 1880, as it's generally known, was ready for launch at the 1928 Motor Show. And that's a picture of an 1880 there. But there were other things stirring within the Morris empire. William Morris was at last persuaded that he had to do something to contend with, to counter the Austin 7, which had been a huge success for Austin, for Herbert Austin, and had in fact saved Austin's bacon. Morris's answer was the Morris Minor, which was a rather more sophisticated device than an Austin 7. In fact, it was rather too sophisticated. For some completely unfathomable reason, it had an expensive to make overhead camshaft engine. Now, that's all very well in a 6-cylinder upmarket car, but when you're trying to make a cheap car to rival one of the cheapest cars on the British market, the Austin 7, what on earth are you doing putting an overhead camshaft engine in? This was essentially a Wolseley-designed engine, Morris having bought the Wolseley company the previous year. But not a good move putting that engine in the Morris Minor. In fact, it was plain silly. But it was a good starting point for a more sporting engine for a little sports car. At first, Kimber seemingly showed no interest in the Minor. At least that's what some people say. This sort of period in history, there are lots of imponderables, things that, depending on which side you looked at things from, you might interpret history in a different way. But the story is that Kimber showed no interest in the Minor at first, but a couple of his men who were working down at Cowley on the future 1880 became aware of this little small Morris and suggested that maybe the chassis could form the basis of a little sports car. A body was knocked together, just made of fabric over a wood frame. And Kimber thought, do you know what? There's something in this as an idea. Maybe we should try a little small sports car based on the Morris Minor. So at the 1928 Motor Show, Kimber had two new models. He had the 1880 6-cylinder and this little 847cc minor-based model, which was called the Midget. A car that a few months before hadn't been in his plans at all. And that's a picture there of the M-Type, a jaunty little car with its fabric body, which was a clever little thing. Fabric body means you don't have to worry about any press tools or anything like that. The fabric, it comes pre-coloured, and the only painting that needs to be done is for the bonnet and the wings. So Kimber was able to get that midget onto the market for £185. It was originally priced at 175, but he put another tenner on before the car really made it into production. And the bodies were provided 6 at a time from Car Bodies. So that was quite something as well for Car Bodies, a nice contract there. And that £185 was a quite hefty markup from the £125 that Morris asked for its own little sporting version of the Minor. So it looked like Kimber was onto a good thing there. Orders poured in for the Midget. Not, alas, for the 1880, which actually was only ever modestly successful. Instead, impecunious enthusiasts, and I use that term advisedly because in those days, you had to be well off to afford a car of any sort. Bear in mind that an awful lot of people weren't able to afford even a second-hand Ford Popular until the beginning of the 1960s, such as my father, for example. But people that didn't have a lot of money but could afford a car, wanted something a bit sporting, really fell for the midget. It soon became a fixture in sporting events, and in the 1930 Land's End trial, no fewer than 30 MG midgets were entered. Kimber was clearly on a roll, and in the end, more than 3,000 of these first M-type midgets would be made. In late 1929, Kimber moved to a new factory in Abingdon, which was to be MG's home until 1980. That's a picture of the factory. And the next picture is of Sir Francis Samuelson, who was a local businessman who rallied MGs, including that particular car, a man who had, you find all sorts of interesting little things when you're researching a book. I discovered that he had a rather tragic life because his mother died as a result of an accident at the hairdresser's. She went in to a hairdresser's and asked for a petroleum hair wash, which was apparently the thing at the time. Her hair caught light. And she died as a result of her head catching light at the hairdressers. So there's probably a moral there somewhere, but we won't dwell any further on that. So for the next 6 years, all new MGs were spun off from this little M-type MG, and the little M-type midget, and the 1880 quietly faded out. Now, we all know that if you want to lose money quickly, one of the best ways to do that is to go motor racing. The motor industry is filled with stories of companies going bust because they thought it was glamorous and fun to go motor racing. Kimber wanted to go motor racing, and it was an important part of the publicity of motor cars in those early days when motor cars were frequently the playthings of rich enthusiasts. William Morris, who paid the bills, because Morris garages always remained part of the Morris empire, had little interest in motor racing. Kimber's genius was to, if you like, do a Bugatti and do the same as Ettore Bugatti did in France. Kimber set up a competitions department, but not to race works cars. What he'd do was build off-the-peg racing cars, which he would then sell to customers who would then pay to have them prepared in his racing shop. So the actual financial exposure was relatively limited. After a modified midget, he came up with a little bomb of a car called the C-type midget. 14 of these were delivered for the 1931 Double 12 race, which was a 24-hour race at Brooklands. MGs came home in the first 5 places and won the class and the team prizes. And that picture there shows a lineup of MG C-types. On top of that, Kimber worked with a chap called George Easton to develop midget-based cars that took speed records in Britain and in France. Easton paid, and Kimber, clever Kimber, got all the publicity. And that's a picture of Easton with one of his record-breaking cars. The next thing that hits one when one studies Cecil Kimber's career is how fast he moved in the first half of the 1930s. Model followed model. First came a small 6-cylinder car, the F-Type Magna, using the mechanicals of the Wolseley Hornet, which was a little 6-cylinder car made by the Wolseley subsidiary of the Great Morris Empire. And you can see there a picture of the F-Type. It's very much a car that's got a lot of bonnet and not much body, a bit like some of the early cars made by Jaguar founder William Lyons, the SS1 and the SS2, for example. The story goes that Kimber had actually leapt at the opportunity to soak up at a cheap price a last batch of a particular type of overhead camshaft Wolseley six-cylinder engine before Wolseley changed the design of the camshaft drive. So he, again, was quick on his feet, jumped and got the basis for a new model. 3 further six-cylinder models followed, and the original midget gave way to the J-type, a gorgeous little car. This really established the stylistic gene pool for future MGs. Elegant little car with a slab tank at the back, cutaway doors, and at first cycle wings and later more swoopy front wings. That was a style that continued right the way through to the 1950s. Competition successes, meanwhile, piled up. And there was a special six-cylinder competition car, the K3 Magnet. That's a picture there of the K3 Magnet. The most prestigious result was a class win and a class second place in the 1933 Mille Miglia, which generated much publicity for MG. That's a picture of the menu of the celebratory dinner or luncheon, I can't remember which, of the Mille Miglia success. And it's actually in the menu of His Royal Highness Prince George, who had an even more salacious private life than his brother Edward the Eighth, as in Mrs. Simpson fame. But with all this, you have to make money. Was Kimber making any money? The accounts for the period do actually survive, and I had a bit of fun going through them a few years ago, and it became clear that John Thornley, who ended up running MG in the post-war years, was absolutely right. Thornley said to me once, he said, every other year, Kim went cap in hand to Morris for a bag of gold to bail him out. And if you look at the figures, it's true. 1 year profit, 1 year loss, 1 year profit, 1 year loss. So John Thornley was right. Competition wasn't the free ride that you might have thought. Some years the costs were relatively high. But what really caused me to raise my eyebrows was the amount of money that Kimber spent that was entered in a column known as satisfaction of customers. To cut a long story short, the cars weren't reliable and they weren't particularly well built. Kimber compounded that error with the car that you see here, which is a pillarless saloon car. It's a pillarless K-type Magnet, and the car had a flexible chassis that flexed the body itself. The body, as it was pillarless, didn't have a center pillar, and basically the movement of the chassis pulled the body to bits. Worse, sales after initial few boom years started to move downwards and crashed downwards sharply in 1935. There were now rivals on the market, and there was a question mark about where MG would be going next. Into this picture comes a guy called Leonard Lord, who is the chap with William Morris in the picture that you see here. Leonard Lord took charge of operations at Cowley, the Morris headquarters and the main factory, in 1933. Morris knew that his business was in a mess. Lord was a brilliant production engineer and a very shrewd businessman. He could see that model ranges needed to be tidied up and maximum commonality of parts across Morris, Wolseley and MG cars had to be established. In particular, Morris and Wolseley needed to become more closely aligned. And at that stage, Wolseley cars had got overhead camshaft engines when, for example, when the average Wolseley owner probably wouldn't have cared if he had a camshaft on the roof of his car. Out went those overhead camshaft engines that had been the basis of all Cecil Kimber's cars from 1928 onwards. What was Kimber going to do in a situation like that? Quite honestly, we can't be totally sure, because he was making plans, um, but those plans didn't come to fruition. The first inkling that something dramatic was possibly in the offing came in spring 1935 when a brand new racing car was announced, and this was the R-Type. Kimber's previous racing car, the Q-Type, had got far too much power for its chassis, and the R-Type remedied this. It was, in fact, the most advanced racing car in Britain at the time when it came out in 1935. It had a backbone chassis, a bit like a Lotus Elan, if you like, and all-independent suspension. Backbone chassis, all-independent suspension. We're in 1935. That was advanced. Word was let drop that this could form the basis of a new generation of MG road cars. And this started to look more likely when Kimber's men started work on a new big saloon. Kimber had borrowed a Bentley, and his aim, it seems, was clear: a move further upmarket. If you think that MGs are always small little sports cars, bear in mind that Kimber was doing at the time what William Lyons was doing with SS cars, moving up with his SS Jaguars, moving up market. It's what Triumph was doing with its Gloria range. It was what Riley was doing. These companies were moving into higher profit, higher priced sectors of the market, and Kimber wanted a share of that cake. It all made sense. So what he was working on in 1935 was a new big MG, which would have a similar chassis to the R-Type and would possibly have a 3.5-litre Woolsey engine. But a storm was brewing. The structure of Morris's empire was increasingly complex and risked causing Morris troubles with the taxman. He'd already had a couple of run-ins with the taxman, which he managed to win. Also, Morris wanted to float the company, have a share offering to liberate money for his philanthropic interests, because he was becoming a great donor. He was in a way to becoming really the Bill Gates of his time as a philanthropist. So a major restructuring was needed. And this is all happening at the same time as Leonard Lord was trying to make sense of a complicated and unwieldy model range. The upshot of all this was that the MG Car Company, which had been the personal property of Sir William Morris, was absorbed into the main Morris Company and came under closer control from Cowley. MGs henceforth would be designed at the Morris factory with a maximum use of components from new Morris and Wolseley cars. The final nail in the coffin, or so it was seen at the time, was that the MG competition department would be closed and there'd be no more specialist racing cars. So all this meant it was the end of the R-Type. The R-Type was stopped after just a handful had been made, and this big saloon car that could have been a rival to the Triumphs and the SS Jaguars was also canned. In 1936, a new MG came out, 2.3-litre saloon called the SA, and this was followed by a 1.5-litre car called the VA. Both these cars were based on components from Leonard Lord's new ranges of Wolseley cars. You can see there a picture of the SA and the VA. Kimber was cowed, but not unbowed. He had an input into the style of the cars. He made sure that they were peppered with octagon badges and octagon-shaped gear levers, and virtually everything he could was octagon-shaped, apart from the road wheels. And actually, they weren't bad cars. I mean, I've driven SAs, I've driven VAs, and they actually drive very well. But at the time, people were a bit snooty about them being based on Wolseys. It was a bit like people being snooty about the X-Type Jaguar being based on a Ford Mondeo. It was considered not quite as it should be, old chap. But they were fine. And the overhead camshaft engine disappeared from the MG Midget. The P-Type was replaced by the T-Type with a Wolseley 10 pushrod engine, an old-fashioned cork-in-oil clutch like Morris had used for many years, and hydraulic brakes. which was considered a bit un-MG-like at the time. Brakes had previously been by cable, but hydraulic brakes actually work much better. Production rose. The balance sheets showed black. Kimber was enthusiastic, at least in public, about the new models, which in truth, as he got older, they probably suited him quite well. His last cars were in fact VAs. He liked the VA very much. As for motorsport, he supported trials teams now, and he managed to get William Morris to agree to support a chap called Goldie Gardner, who went record-breaking with a streamlined MG, which he and William Morris financed between them. There's a picture of EX135 there, and there's another picture which shows Nuffield in EX135. Gardner's record-breaking generated much publicity, and in the end, EX135 exceeded 200 miles an hour with an 1100cc engine, which is going some. And that's 1939 we're talking about. So that really was quite an achievement. And of course, it garnered wonderful publicity for MG without Kimber having to spend very much at all, which pleased William Morris. Meanwhile, Kimber remained very much the public face of MG, notably fronting a series of signed advertisements in 1938 and 1939. You can see one there that depicts sailing, of course, a passion of Cecil Kimber's. War, of course, stopped play, as we know, and Kimber had to adapt. Like many companies, MG had to scrape around for war contracts. Kimber managed to get contracts to rebuild tanks and to equip tanks. And above all, he swung a contract to have MG build the entire front end of the Albemarle bomber, which was a hugely complicated structure stuffed full of electrics. And in fact, MG didn't just master the assembly of this front end of the front sort of cockpit of the Albemarle, but they actually developed testing rigs that were taken up by the aircraft industry itself. So, you know, the MG factory, it was a small factory in Abingdon, but the people there were super competent, and they could show the aircraft industry a thing or two. So that's something to bear in mind, and something for people in Abingdon to feel proud of course. But Cowley, the heart of the Morris Empire, was a snake pit. And Kimber's independence of spirit in getting that contract, in particular for the Albemarle, was to be his undoing. I was able to do a lot of research when I wrote a book on Morris, using original interview transcripts from a biography of William Morris. And it became clear when you looked at the transcripts of all the people involved with Morris that everyone was at each other's throats. One guy memorably referred to a couple of his colleagues as pink-eyed rats. The atmosphere at Cowley was, well, I think it made the Court of the Borgias look like a Sunday school outing. The upshot of all this was that eventually Kimber in 1941 was sacked on a trumped up charge of doing something or the other administratively that was not appropriate. Everything's a little bit vague on this one. But what had happened, there was a dog-eat-dog atmosphere at Cowley. Kimber's cards had been marked. His private life had not met with the approval of Lady Nuffield, William Morris's wife. William Morris had been ennobled as Lord Nuffield, by the way. Lady Nuffield was a bit of an old prude. That's a picture of her there. She wasn't a liked presence at all, and she certainly didn't approve of anything as racy as going off with another woman and then marrying that woman when your wife's barely cold in her grave. That did not go down very well with Lillian Morris. Similarly, those advertisements, like that sailing advertisement we've seen, rankled. It looked like Kimber was promoting himself. Actually, it was quite sensible PR to associate his name with the cars and to put across that sort of clubby, I'm here to care for you as a customer sort of image. But it rankled back at Cowley. And then he went off on his own bat and got this Albemarle bomber contract, and worse, made a success of it. And this really rubbed Lord Nuffield's fur up the wrong way. The contract had been secured with the aid of the Minister for Aircraft Production, Lord Beaverbrook. Beaverbrook was aggressive and not at all likeable chap. The story goes that he once rang Sir Charles Craven of the aircraft company Vickers when Sir Charles was on the loo. Beaverbrook demanded to speak to Sir Charles immediately, and the reply, Sir Charles told his secretary, tell him I can only deal with one shit at a time. He was not liked. Now, on top of the Albemarle contract, William Morris had swung an extraordinary deal with the British government to set up a factory at Castle Bromwich to make the Spitfire. It was a catastrophe, and as the Battle of Britain approached, they hadn't made a single Spitfire because of rank bad management, amongst other things. And Beaverbrook one day rang up Lord Nuffield and, in the course of a very short conversation, took away the running of that factory from Morris. And that really hurt. Lord Nuffield basically went into his tent and sulked, in the words of his number two, Miles Thomas. And Miles Thomas, who was a bit of a sort of bootlicking courtier, arranged to have Kimber dismissed. Miles Thomas, a story for another day. Kimber went to work for coach builders Charlesworth to help reorganize a satellite factory to produce aircraft parts. Then he moved to a piston manufacturer called Specialoid. They were not fulfilling jobs. Kimber spent most of his time at Charlesworth off sick. He continued to be ill at Specialoids, and it seems pretty clear that he came close to having a nervous breakdown. He handed in his resignation at Specialoids, only to have it thrown back at him. He was given a better job in charge of sales promotion, and gradually he refound his morale. He had talks with Donald Healey of Austin Healey fame after the war, of course, Austin Healey, and it seems also with the boss of Standard, Sir John Black. And that's a nice picture of Black with Harry Ferguson, with whom Kimber also had quite a long correspondence with Harry Ferguson. Harry Ferguson wanted to get Kimber enlisted to help him make tractors in England. In fact, Harry Ferguson ended up making tractors with Sir John Black, but he did try and get Kimber on board. Meanwhile, Kimber was writing articles for Yachting World and for the Motoring Weeklies, and in particular, he wrote a two-part article for the Autocar in which he laid out the design of his ideal sports car. That showed that he'd got some sort of command of engineering, and that he got a vision for post-war sports cars. He planned a sort of semi-retirement and bought a cottage down in Sussex. His days at the forefront of the motor industry were over, he started to tell friends. What he didn't know was that in early 1945, he was a victim of a stupid railway accident when a train that he was in slipped back on the rails, and the carriage he was in was one of two carriages that fell off the track and were crushed. And in 1945, Cecil Kimber was no more. How MG developed after that is another story for another time. I hope that gives you a little insight into the life of Cecil Kimber, 1888 to 1945. Thank you very much.